Now, we know Warren lines up everywhere, just like Travis Kelce lines up everywhere, just like Mark Andrews lines up everywhere. That's the way the game has evolved, where tight ends, Ross, do line up all over the formation. But Loveland is just a smoother, more explosive mover.
You're tuned in to the Ross Tucker Football Podcast, guiding your gridiron journey, none other than your host, former NFL lineman, Ross Tucker.
Oh, yeah, it is. But it's not just any Ross Tucker Football Podcast. It never is. But especially not on a teaching tutorial Thursday when the civilian GOAT is back in the house. Such a fun week so far, by the way. Going ahead and talking with Chris Nowinski about the latest with CTE on Monday. Yesterday, Michael Hoyt, the edge rusher for the Buffalo Bills. He's a fun player. I enjoy watching him. Unique player, D tackle at Brown, now playing more or less as an edge rusher in the NFL. Loved his personality. Hope you guys did as well. Certainly, if you're into best ball at all, you got to listen or watch youtube.com/Ross Tucker NFL. You have to, the Fantasy Feast. And then the Even Money podcast, we had part 2 with Warren Sharp going over the schedule, which was really fun. Almost as fun as getting a chance to dive in with my guy, Greg Cosell, every week. It's Big Show time.
The Big Show.
All right, Greg, we're wrapping up our rookie skill position fit series, which means starting next week, we're going to get into the divisional previews, which is really fun. So in June, we start to preview each division one by one. You know, we know who the free agents are. We know the coaching changes. We know who they've drafted. So we can kind of start to preview what we're thinking about, what we're looking at. We are presented by DraftKings. The crown is yours. We did quarterbacks, running backs, wide receivers. We wrap up today, Greg, with tight ends. And we'll start with Colston Loveland in Chicago with the Bears. Little bit of a surprise to some people that Loveland went ahead of Tyler Warren. But here's why we have you, Greg. We're talking about the fit in Ben Johnson's offense. And clearly, Ben Johnson thought that Loveland was a better fit for what he needed or wanted than Tyler Warren from Penn State.
Yeah, we can debate the tight end in terms of Warren versus Loveland and what you think of them when you look at their traits and just as individual players. That's a different debate. But in Chicago, what Ben Johnson thought and what the organization thought, that Warren was a bit of a redundancy with Cole Kmet, that they were very similar in terms of their traits profile. Again, we can say Warren's better. That's not the point. The point is the traits profile and how they would be deployed in Ben Johnson's offense. Warren was similar to Kmet. Loveland is a totally different player. Loveland is not similar to Warren or Kmet. Loveland is much more of a receiving tight end who gives you more of the versatility where he can line up. He can line up essentially as a wide receiver. He can be much more of a motion player. He's a different player than either Warren or Kmet. So they drafted Loveland because they felt clearly, not only is he very gifted, of course, but that he adds a dimension to their offense that, as good as Warren may be, and he may end up being great, that Warren is too much like Kmet in the context of a Ben Johnson offense.
Okay, so there's a couple things here we need to get to, Greg, because I want to make sure the listeners and the people watching on YouTube understand this. First of all, Tyler Warren had an unbelievable receiving season last year at Penn State. And as you know, they lined him up everywhere. He was out wide. He was in the backfield. He was a quarterback. He ran the ball. He was everywhere. So there are people that watched, a lot of football last year, Greg, that are saying, well, what is Greg talking about? Tyler Warren had a great receiving season, and Tyler Warren lined up all over the place in that Penn State offense. So I want you to dive even deeper and be more specific as to what Loveland can do or how you think he'd be deployed and Warren wouldn't. Because I always try to think about what the listeners think, and they're thinking, what is Greg talking about? I saw Tyler Warren do a lot of this stuff.
Right. Well, And look, we're in an era where tight ends, no matter what their athletic traits and profile do line up all over the formation. But Loveland is just a smoother, different kind of athlete than Warren. He's leaner, he's quicker, he's a little more explosive. He's just a different kind of player. Now, we know Warren lines up everywhere, just like Travis Kelce lines up everywhere, just like Mark Andrews lines up everywhere. That's the way the game has evolved, where tight ends, Ross, do line up all over the formation. But Loveland is just a smoother, more explosive mover. Now, again, we don't know how all this will play out. We're at the point where neither one of these guys have played in the league, and there's so many variables. But there's no question in my mind that they drafted Loveland because he's a different kind of quote-unquote tight end than Warren. To me, Warren, and I hate making comparisons because that's all people think about, but to me, Warren could end up being stylistically more like a George Kittle type player, and there's nothing wrong with that, obviously. That's the kind of player Kmet is stylistically. He's not at the level of Kittle, whereas Loveland is just a different kind of athlete.
Well, this is how I look at it, and somebody explained it to me. Basically, like Tyler Warren's an awesome player. Loveland runs routes more like a receiver.
He does.
And looks like a receiver and can run more receiver routes, like getting in and out of his
Yes.
break, whereas that's not really Warren. He's not like a pure, smooth route runner.
No.
It's like Loveland looks like a guy that played receiver in high school, and Warren kind of looks like a guy that played quarterback in high. He wasn't running routes.
Right.
He wasn't doing those type of things.
I think the more interesting thing with the Bears, quite frankly, is, and this Ben Johnson and staff will work through this through the remaining OTAs, mini camps, training camp, is how much 12 personnel versus 11 personnel that they will play, because they drafted Luther Burden in the second round, a player whose tape I love. So now they've got Moore, Odunze, and Burden as the three wideouts. I know Burden, I believe, is hurt now, but he'll be fine. And then they've got Loveland and Kmet. So I think it's going to be fascinating to see what the balance is between playing 12 personnel and 11 personnel. They can go either way. And as you said, and that's the point about Loveland, is he's truly more of a wide receiver in the way in which he moves.
That was my thought, is that they don't really have a slot receiver. That they don't really have a third receiver. Right now, maybe Burden's that guy, but he's a rookie second round pick. I think Ben Johnson kind of gave himself, Greg, multiple options for that guy in the slot. Whether he can go big with Loveland or he can go with Luther Burden, have a faster, quicker guy.
I mean, who's Amon-Ra St. Brown in the Bears offense? Because that player is obviously really critical. Amon-Ra St. Brown lined up all over the formation in Detroit. And no one would argue that Amon-Ra St. Brown is at the level in terms of traits of, let's say, Jamar Chase or Jefferson. But within the context of a Ben Johnson offense, he was an absolutely critical player.
Meanwhile, Tyler Warren with the Colts, I think, Greg, is a good scheme fit. Whether it's the RPOs or Tyler's not afraid to get after people as a blocker either.
And that's key. That's a great point you made, because, look, they're going to have a quarterback. I don't want to say have a quarterback issue. They'll have a quarterback competition, and we'll see who wins. But the point is, their offense is still going to start with the run game. And Warren can line up in line and be a good blocker. He's a bigger man than Loveland. He just fits what they want to do. So we'll see how that plays out, because the quarterback will be the interesting point. Now, again, this is a great example where, because the quarterback situation is unsettled, Ross, it might be a case where Warren's not going to catch 85 balls. He might catch 40 balls because the quarterback situation remains unsettled. They don't have a great pass game. And then people might say, well, Warren's not as good as we thought, which won't be the case at all. It just becomes a function of team and how they play. But I agree with you 100%. I mean, Warren's going to line up in line and he's going to block.
And when he doesn't, if he's split out and they run the RPOs, which I think Steichen will run a lot of RPOs.
So do I.
Warren did run a bunch of slants for Penn State, and he's terrific run after catch.
Yes.
That's a route. That's not a route where you need great feet. You know what I mean?
No.
Like, you're getting across the face and you're slanting, big body. They can put it on him, and then he'll break that first tackle usually.
Correct. No, that's a really good fit. For what they want to do, but make no mistake, that offense will start with Jonathan Taylor, and I think a lot of people are unaware that over the last 7-8 games last year, Taylor was as good as any running back in the league.
He is a special player.
Yep.
I did. I'm trying to think. Maybe just one Colts game, that game against the Titans. But he's very, very fun to watch. All right, some of these other guys are interesting as well because you don't know how much playing time they'll get or what their situation will be. I'm really curious to see what Mason Taylor looks like with the Jets.
Yeah.
We know from Justin Fields' time in Chicago, he does like to throw to the tight end. Garrett Wilson will obviously get a lot of attention. What do you think about Mason Taylor in that offense in New York, Greg?
Yeah, I thought watching his tape at LSU that there was a lot more there. They used him in kind of a condensed way. That's the offense they chose to run. But he's got good athleticism. He did catch seam balls on occasion. I think he can be a vertical dimension. I think there's a lot there with Mason Taylor that still can be, deployed once he gets to the NFL. We'll see, how it all plays out. He's a rookie. Obviously, you have Justin Fields. We'll see how they structure their offense. I mean, there's no question when you have Justin Fields that you want to have the quarterback run game by design be a meaningful factor in your offense. So, again, it might not be a case where he's targeted a lot, and people always look at production and volume, target volume, to determine whether a player is doing a good job. But that may not be the case with Mason Taylor. But I think as he grows and develops, Ross, there's a lot more to what he's capable of doing athletically than he showed in college.
Such a unique offense, right? Because I remember watching those receivers and Jaden Daniels. It felt like he was just throwing fades to Malik Neighbors as well as Brian Thomas, and they were catching him. I mean, it was working. He won the Heisman. I'm not blaming him, but you did not see the tight end go down the field that much.
No.
It was more the receivers on go routes.
Even this year, Taylor caught a ton of balls where he just motioned behind the quarterback and they threw it to him in the flat. I mean, he caught a ton of balls like that. He was critical on third down. He was a really important piece of their offense, but those were shorter throws. If it was 3rd and 6, they throw it to him for 7 or 8 yards. He wasn't really used as an intermediate vertical dimension very often at LSU this past year.
All right, so the next guy I know that you really liked. I remember during the pre-draft process, you talking about how much you liked his tape. I think he had maybe an injury history, maybe didn't play much until this year, but the Seahawks took Elijah Arroyo out of Miami with the 18th pick of the 2nd round. And there's some talk that maybe they would trade Noah Fant or that Noah Fant could get cut. But at any rate, they got Arroyo now, so they kind of have a Fant replacement if they want to.
Yeah, I thought that he was the most vertically explosive tight end in the draft. And keep in mind, he was asked to block a lot. Now, again, we can debate the nature of the blocks in the run game. Is he going to line up and just move defensive ends? Maybe not. But they had Damian Martinez, so they had an NFL run game with the quarterback under center. And he was asked a lot to do that split flow zone blocking where he crossed the formation and sealed the backside. I mean, that every team does that in the league. So he was involved in the run game. He can improve as a blocker clearly, but it's not as if he never did it. And as I said, just the vertical element to his game, I think, is something that really, really stood out on tape. People are concerned because he has an injury history. He only really played this 1 year at the U where he played pretty much a full season. But there's a lot there. And when your tight end has a vertical dimension, that can open up a lot of things for your offense, Ross, as you well know.
I'm glad, Greg, sometimes I swear you're like reading my mind. With all of the 2 deep safety looks, right? All the 2 deep safety looks, I don't know everything about coverage, right? But I know when there's 1 safety in the middle of the field, you'd hear the coaches say, middle of the field is closed. Right. Because there's a guy right in the middle. Right. When there's 2 deep safeties, middle of the field is open. And if you have a tight end that can threaten those guys down the seam, down the middle quickly, that's a problem for the defense. Wow. They need to be aware of that guy. And so even just him, Greg, even if he just sprints down the middle of the field, that holds those safeties. They can't expand and help out the corners on the outside as much. They have to honor the guy running down the middle.
And keep one other thing in mind. We see a lot of teams now play quarters looks, 4 across, where if you on offense are on a 2-by-2 set, meaning 2 receivers on each side with a back in the backfield, Arroyo, if he's the number 2 receiver, meaning the slot receiver to one side, when defenses play quarters, that safety has to be responsible, and he essentially has to match up to number 2 vertical. And Arroyo has enough speed where there's a lot of safeties that he will pose problems for if he's the slot receiver running vertically at a safety who has to match up, because quarters essentially becomes man at some point. In fact, I've heard a lot of coaches explain quarters by saying it's man with rules. So, he's the kind of tight end that can really attack safeties vertically, even in a 2-high quarters shell.
We talked about this guy after the draft because it was one of the more surprising picks, at least to me. I was a little surprised this guy actually went ahead of Arroyo, and I forgot it till I'm just looking at the tight ends right now. And that's Terrance Ferguson from Oregon, who went to the Rams. And interestingly, Greg, you compared him right away to Higbee, who the Rams already have.
Yeah.
So I guess you have a pretty good idea of how he might fit in that Rams offense.
Yeah, and obviously I made that comparison when I did my work on him, which was before the draft. That's what I want people to understand. I didn't say that once they drafted him. I put that in my notes, Ross, when I was evaluating him, which was a month before the draft. I thought he's very similar to Higbee. People may remember Higbee came out of Western Kentucky and was essentially a split player. Now, obviously with the Rams, because they run the ball, he developed, because he's willing to block, into a player that can line up in line and still block. But I thought Ferguson was similar in that regard, in the sense that he's not truly explosive. You wouldn't say Higbee is explosive the way, let's say, Arroyo is, nor is Ferguson. But he's kind of complete. He does a lot of things well. And he's, in some ways, he kind of also reminded me a little bit of Jake Ferguson, who's the Cowboys starting tight end. Guys who are not explosive athletes, but still can run. When Jake Ferguson, a couple years ago, when he wasn't hurt, he made seam catches. Terrance Ferguson can do that. He's a good blocker because they had a really good run game with Jordan James at Oregon, as you know. And he's kind of a complete tight end. He's just not special. And you could say the exact same thing about Tyler Higbee. He's kind of a complete tight end, but you wouldn't talk about him as a top 3 or 4 tight end in the league, but he's just a really good player. And I think Terrance Ferguson can become that guy.
And there's a lot of value, even if you're not, if you're not going to be elite, if you're not going to be one of the top 3 or 4 or 5 guys, if you are a complete tight end, a lot of value there.
Correct.
A lot of value in being able to do everything. Like, I don't ever think Goddard for the Eagles gets enough credit. He's been getting banged up, but Goddard does a lot of things really well.
Yeah, in a different situation, Goddard would be talked about as a top 3 or 4 guy in the league. It's just the nature of the Eagles' offense doesn't allow him to catch 90 balls.
I think probably the last guy I wanted to talk to you about, Greg, is Harold Fannin Jr., who didn't go until the 3rd round. That surprised me a little bit. High in the 3rd round. He went to the Cleveland Browns, where they already have a tight end they really like in Njoku, obviously. Fannin put up, you talk about Goddard in another offense would catch 90 balls. I think Fannin did catch 90 balls for Bowling Green last year. I don't remember talking with you about him pre-draft. I'm sure we did, Greg, but I forget what your thoughts were on Fannin.
Yeah, I was in and out on him, but I'll tell you this. If you talk about now his projection and his transition to the team that drafted him, the Browns, I think what Kevin Stefanski wants to do is kind of reset that offense. Obviously, we don't know who the starting quarterback will be, but that, I don't want to say it's irrelevant, but it's irrelevant in the sense that he wants to reset with the run game, and he wants, because they drafted Quinshon Judkins and Dylan Sampson, with Judkins being the feature back. they drafted a second tight end in Fannin to go with Njoku because they want to play more 12 personnel. They want to have that run game be the starting point, which we know Kevin Stefanski, when all is right for his offense, that's the way he wants to play. It all starts with the run game and the play action off of it. So I think Fannin is viewed as kind of the second tight end with Njoku. And Fannin, the best part of what he does is catch the football. Now, I didn't love him, but that's irrelevant. We're talking about his transition to the league, and that's how Kevin Stefanski sees him, and they want to line up and play with 12 personnel.
Refresh my memory, Greg. Why didn't you love him? What did you not like?
This may be just a personal thing, but he was a very choppy runner. Like, I felt like he was very stiff. Now, he did have good speed. It wasn't as if he was slow, and you could argue that he could run down the seam. He was physical after the catch. Like I said, it might just be a personal thing that I just didn't love the way he ran. He looked choppy and stiff to me, but I could well be wrong on that.
You got to check him out on social media at Greg Cosell. That way you always know what he's up to. Can't wait to do the divisional previews starting next week. Nothing gets you more ready for the season than Greg's divisional previews. Greg, thank you so much for the time. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Ross. That was great. Appreciate it.
Jack, I am so fired up. My Labatt Blue cooler backpack. I've never had a cooler backpack. It is on its way. I will show it in one of my social posts at Ross Tucker NFL. At a minimum, everybody listening, this should be mandatory to go to rewards.labattusa.com just to see the merch there. It's incredible, and you don't have to pay for it. Just buy Labatt Blue Light or Labatt Blue, upload your receipts, you'll rack up the points, and then you get the merch. It's genius. Rewards.labattusa.com.
Tuck's Takes.
All right, Ross, there's not a lot of news since yesterday other than the 49ers. They signed punter Thomas Morstead, and there was multiple guys like Tyreek Hill and Steelers tackle Broderick Jones that discussed losing a bunch of weight this offseason.
Well, listen, you know how I know it's been a slow week? I'd say out of like our 4 or 5 Tuck's Takes this week, 2 of them have been punter related. AJ Cole got that huge contract, and now Morstead gets signed. That's a slow week, folks. That's a slow week news-wise. I'll say this. I've said this before, Jack. I'd always rather hear about guys losing weight in the offseason than gaining weight. Tyreek Hill went from 197 to 183, he said, lost 14 pounds. That is a significant difference when you're under 200 pounds. To lose 14, I'll be really interested to see what he looks like. And Broderick Jones lost 20 pounds from 325 to 305. He needed to do something because he struggled last year. He's got a long way to go. So, look, doesn't guarantee anything for either guy, but if you gave me 10 guys and 5 gained weight in the offseason, put weight on, and 5 lost weight, I'll bet on the guys that lose weight. We're almost in June, which means it's almost beach time, most weekends for your boy, which means it's yummy, yummy Smirnoff in my tummy. I've told you guys before, I drink it with like Gatorade Zero or hydration drinks or like Pedialyte. It's perfect. I'm hydrating while I'm drinking delicious Smirnoff vodka, the #1 vodka in the world and an official vodka partner of the NFL. And it's not expensive. It's not one of these crazy expensive vodkas out there. Grab a bottle of Smirnoff at your local retailer and head to Smirnoff.com to find recipes of delicious cocktails perfect for game day. Please drink responsibly. Smirnoff #21 vodka, distilled from grain. It's 40% alcohol by volume. The Smirnoff Company, New York, New York. Please not share with anyone under legal drinking age. Let's get to an email question. Jack, doesn't happen often, but we got time.
Ever wanted to ask an NFL player a question? Well, here's your chance. It's time to Ask Ross.
All right, this comes from Jan Lehman. They say, I have a question for you. I'm not sure if you've ever answered this before, but here goes. Since you do both radio, TV, that includes both color and sideline reporting, how much difference is there in your preparation for each, and how much is there between TV or radio?
Good question. And Jan, by the way, remember, if you ever want to ask me a question, it's really easy to. Just send me an email, ross@rosstucker.com. And if you take advantage of any of the sponsors you ever hear on the show, or just take a picture of you drinking a Labatt Blue Light or Smirnoff, buying a bottle of Smirnoff, email it to me, ross@rosstucker.com. You'll go right to the top of the list, and we'll get to more email questions during the summer. Jan's the one, by the way, Jack, that always knows where I park at the Bills games, and he delivers a couple beers and like cinnamon buns to my car. After the game, I get out to my car, and for my drive back, I've got some cinnamon buns, and then when I get to the hotel, the beer. So, Jan, good question. It's probably a longer conversation. So, in order, the most prep is TV on color, right? Like the color commentator for TV, then radio, then sideline. So the difference is for sideline, I'm only going to be making like 6 to 10 observations a game that are either injury related or things I'm seeing during the game. So I don't necessarily need to have quite the same level of preparation. I need to know the storylines and the injuries going into the game, but don't need to do quite as much prep for that. I would say radio and TV is similar. The difference is really the time commitment for the employer, right? So for both, I'm watching the game they played the week prior at a minimum, and I'm reading all the clips about the teams. I'm, making sure I know the names and numbers of every guy. I'm talking with people, certainly on the field before the game. The difference really, Jan, isn't my individual prep. It's the time that you put into it. For an NFL game, I get there Thursday night or Friday morning for TV. For radio, I get there 3 hours before the game. So the biggest difference is really just there's no production meetings for radio, but there are for TV. That's a huge difference. By the way, I do have winners this week. Speaking of Ross, at rosstucker.com, bcawley15 on Instagram, spreading the word at rosstuckerpod. Scotty Boyd used the code Ross to get Warren Sharp's book from the Even Money podcast. And Bruce Bunt said he loves the Ross Tucker podcast on YouTube, youtube.com/RossTuckerNFL. Have a terrific weekend, everybody. We'll be back with a superstar guest on Monday. I think we're done here.
Thanks for tuning in to the Ross Tucker Football Podcast. Make sure to also check out Even Money, Fantasy Feast, and College Draft, all on the DraftKings Network on Samsung TV Plus, YouTube, or subscribe to the podcast on your favorite platform.
Shout out myfrontpagestory.com. Listen, it's Father's Day season, whether you like it or not. myfrontpagestory.com, backofficescheduler.com, humanheadnyc.com, Sporticulture, and the always yummy Pizza Boy Brewing.